The following is a special video presentation of the Hennepin County Library.
Hi, welcome to a discussion with James W. Hall. I'm Bruce Southworth, a mystery book reviewer for Publishers Weekly and Druid Review of Mysteries. James Hall is best known for a series of crime novels. The first one was Under Cover of Daylight back in 1987, and most recently Gone Wild, published by Delacorte Press in March of 1995. Others have included Tropical Freeze, Mean High Tide, Bones of Coral, and High Aground. He's also an accomplished poet, having published 4 volumes of poetry and a volume of short stories, and he's currently a professor at Florida International University. Welcome.
Thank you.
Gone Wild, very briefly, starts out with a woman, Allison Farley, who's in the jungles on an orangutan census mission, basically. She has her 2 daughters with her. And then very quickly, one of the daughters is killed by poachers, and this sort of opens up the whole subject of endangered species and poaching and so on and so forth. One thing I wanted to ask you and talk to you a bit about the overall issue of endangered species is the extent of the kind of traffic in endangered species animals, and also the research that you had to do into all of that.
Well, I spent about a month, which is normal for me, before I start to actually write a book, accumulating a lot of data. I see it as a kind of research project in some ways. That's partly because the kinds of books I've always enjoyed in the past are those novels that you read with great excitement, and then you get through and you find out that you learned something about stamp collecting or some oddball thing, and you've widened your knowledge of the world without really intending to, or in a painless sort of way. And since I've always enjoyed those kind of books, I'm trying to do that myself to some extent. So there's a high information content in these thrillers, even though they're basically suspense novels. So I spent about a month. I went to Borneo, where you, as you say, the book opens in the jungle in Borneo. I spent 3 weeks over there, in Singapore and Brunei, and met a lot of the people in the international community whose goal it is to suppress or to stop the traffic in illegal animals. The other part of your question about how much endangered animals are flowing is, the answer is a whole lot. It's incredible. I didn't know this when I started out, but some of my sources that I developed during this time were people in the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Program or Department, for instance, and then the people in the animal rights movement themselves put me on to newsletters and information sources that revealed how much this is going on. Miami, where the book is in part set, and where I'm from, is a national leader in this crime, as we seem to be in so many crimes, much to our discredit. The part of the reason is that since we are a focal point for drug smuggling in such a large amount, that most of the law enforcement effort in the Miami area is focused on drugs, and as a result, there's very little money and very little attention paid to Grand Cayman lizards. The difference between an endangered animal coming through and an illegal animal coming through. No one. Those that could even tell the difference between endangered animals and legal animals are rare to begin with, and most of those people are not members of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Office. So apparently Americans have an enormous appetite for exotic animals of all kinds, legal, illegal, endangered, or non-endangered.
It seemed like so many of the characters, or at least the animals that were coming into this country, you pointed out people wanted them to dress up in cute outfits and to be pets, and so often after they realized that this animal was going to get very large and out of control, that they had to do something to get rid of it. And that brought one of the animals, very much a character in the book, around to a university research lab Was that another area that you had to dig into a little bit too, or is that kind of...
I did a little bit, yeah. There are three basic sources of the consumers, or three basic consumers on the purchasing end of animals, and one is just the general collector, as you say. One is illegal zoos, or zoos that are legal, but they acquire animals in an illegal way. They fudge the paperwork or overlook fudged paperwork. And then there are medical or research facilities, which have a huge appetite for primates in particular. Excuse me. So the scene, there is one scene or a couple of scenes that are set in a psychological lab. Orangutans, which the book focuses on, are not primarily the primate of choice for these research facilities. They prefer chimpanzees because they're smaller and easier to work with. But genetically, orangutans and chimpanzees are so close, and so very, very close to human beings, that they both make ideal subjects for a whole range of psychological testing, physiological testing, as the book describes, a kind of impact study on bone breakage and that sort of thing. Cosmetic studies, all kinds of things. And you're talking about things that are just really, really depressing, especially when you factor in that a lot of the animals that are in those steel chairs or aluminum chairs, bound to these chairs for hours and hours every day. 3 days ago, we're in the canopy in a rainforest somewhere. And the radical adjustment psychologically that these animals must be going through, it just is further torment to the whole process.
Yeah, some of those specific studies you were referred to just now and in the book, they're horrific. One of the things I thought must have been an interesting line to walk was to not sort of anthropomorphize, I don't know if there's such a word as that, but to project a personality really onto the animals, even though all animals do have one and so on, and not make it kind of a person. Right. It must have been a tough...
Yeah, it was one of the artistic, it's a good question, and it was one of the artistic problems that I had to deal with in this book. Is I've always used, and I used in this book, a point of view technique called center of consciousness, in which you basically, you're rendering people in the third person, he, she, but you are, or I am, trying to imitate the flow of their thoughts and the flow of their vocabulary, so that when I'm rendering something from one particular person's point of view, the illusion that I try to create is that these people, that you're getting the actual sense of the way these people think, even though you're really not technically in their head. So when it came time to write these scenes that only the orangutan was privileged to be in, it was a real technical battle to walk that line between creating something that seemed like a believable orangutan's point of view without stepping into grave danger, I imagine, that any reader would say, oh, come on, you don't know how orangutans think or talk. So I had to kind of have it, I was trying to have it both ways. I was trying to have a believable sort of the viewpoint of the orangutan, but to be semi-objective stylistically. So what I wound up doing, I think, is kind of writing Hemingway-esque style in all the orangutan sections that are very flat, very simple, very basic. And one would assume that if speech were possible in orangutans, that certainly it would be something in a very primitive, simple, monosyllabic form. That's what I was playing with in those sections.
Yeah, it worked for me at any rate. And one of the things I thought was also effective in distancing the personality, if you will, of an orangutan from that of a human was there was a scene where Thorne, who recurs from some of your previous books, is there, and he's working at this sort of wildlife, I don't want to call it a zoo, but preserve sort of thing. And there's a little girl questioning him about, that orangutans apparently are animals that rape in the wild and so on.
That's true.
And then, but trying to distance between what an animal does in the wild and what humans do kind of helped break that apart a little bit.
In civilization and culture. I mean, humans rape supposedly in civilized settings, where these that it's wrong in a way to say that orangutans rape. The young, as that scene portrays or describes, the young orangutans force themselves upon unwilling mates, and we could assign the word rape to that, but I don't think it's really appropriate in the animal kingdom in the same way it is in the human kingdom. But that was one of the fun things about writing this book. Another one of the real challenges in writing this book was that I had so much information that I accumulated from all these sources that I spent. It was the most information I've ever had in writing a novel, and this is my sixth novel. And the problem really was, technically for me, how to filter through that information, use the best of it, weed out those parts that would have slowed the story down in some way, and yet be true to all the factual realities that I became aware of in my studies. And you know, sometimes that was a hard choice to make. Do I stop here and put in some information? How do I integrate this information into a dramatic scene? It makes me respect ever more those writers who are effective in doing that kind of Michener-esque thing of getting lots and lots and lots of information into a moving right along story format.
Yeah, without completely overwhelming.
Exactly.
Another element that I thought was interesting, and maybe this is additional information that you had to get, but from the human point of view, there seemed to be, in particular, two very strong mother figures in the book. Allison Farley herself, who's the mother of the girl that was killed and in search of the poachers and the killers, as well as the mother of the two villains in the story, Orlan and Rayon, as they're called. And she seems to be, she's deceased while they're on the scene, but yet she seems to have an awful lot of effect on their action. It's kind of interesting. Was that something you were consciously trying to work in? Or?
Well, it's something, that's a technique that I have used for a long time. It's something I've observed in other people's writing that I appropriated for my own use. And it's a thing I call the echo effect, or duplicates. And I find myself doing that, whether it's conscious or unconscious, I don't know anymore. It's become just my habitual way of looking at the world, and my habitual way of dealing with creative problems, which is to try to find permutations of the same thing, like a canon, a musical canon, where you restate the theme in infinite restatements of it, on and on. So there are lots of mother-child permutations in this book. There is the mother of the orangutan itself, who gets shot out of the trees, who's killed, and that orangutan, the baby orangutan who we follow through the rest of the story, is motherless and seeking mother in a sense as well. And in some ways, Allison becomes his mother, the wildlife protection lady. So yeah, I think part of that stems from, in this particular novel, the fact of the reality that a great deal, 99% of the good guys in this situation are women. In the true field of the research, the Dian Fosseys and the Jane Goodalls and the Birute Galdikas is the woman who is the equivalent in orangutans to Jane Goodall and Dian Fossey with chimpanzees and gorillas. Almost all the animal rights people that are going after smugglers and so on are women, and almost all the bad guys are men. And so as a consequence, that whole gender issue became interesting in a factual way in the book, and so I was playing with that a little bit, with all these deaths.
Another element you seem to be playing with is that of the notion that sort of grassroots individuals really are the ones who are going to have to make a difference in some of these things, because the authorities, and there's a whole raft of authorities, from Harry, the husband, who's a former diplomat and a lawyer, on up to the people at the airport, on up to the Sultan of Brunei, who are just very ineffective in dealing with some of these problems.
Yeah, that's true. Well, I think that's if there is a is a statement of moral position in the book. I don't like to think of novels that way because I like to think of myself as a storyteller rather than as a soapbox speaker. But if there is a moral position in the book, that perhaps is what it is, that there's individual responsibility in this issue of our huge appetite for exotic animals, that we are in effect willing culprits in the demise of entire species around the world. We're, just as we are great consumers of so much of the world's resources, Americans are also guilty in this area too of consuming vast amounts of animals which to us seem wonderful and colorful and may have some positive spiritual effect in our lives, bring a little natural, bring ourselves into contact with the natural world in some intimate way. On the other hand, it has a very destructive, when you multiply it by the numbers of people that have tropical fish or little bits of coral even in their aquarium, and you know that whole world of consuming the natural world is very destructive. But on the other hand, I have to say, to be completely honest with this, that in the case of orangutans, it is similar to the case of many endangered species. There are only 10,000 orangutans in the wild left in Borneo and Sumatra, but most of the responsibility for their destruction as a species comes from the same thing that destroys most species around the world, and that's habitat destruction, not poachers. Poachers are a particularly egregious aspect of the whole equation, but they're not really the source of the destruction. It's our willingness also, and third world's willingness to cut down their hardwood forests to package goods, or
develop and catch up.
To develop their own environments, which quickly wipes out species very, very fast.
I wanted to change gears just a little bit. It seems abrupt, but in the time that you were writing poetry and then began writing a crime novel, I think there was you were teaching a class on
bestsellers.
Bestsellers,
Right.
and at that point you decided to write a crime novel. I read this somewhere, and I'm kind of wondering what triggered the desire to do that. I know from reading some of the things that you've written that you had long read crime novels and stayed with them, but what triggered you in that point?
Well, my reading of crime novels was always done, well, after a certain point. After I went to graduate school and did my master's and PhD in graduate school, I would continue to read the books of my youth that I had always gotten a kind of sinful pleasure out of reading on the weekend. The Elmore Leonards and Raymond Chandler and Dashiell Hammett and Ross MacDonald and John D. MacDonald, the classical mystery novels, although Dutch Leonard is a little later. While during the week I would be teaching serious, so-called serious high road literature. And when I taught this bestseller class, it was really a revelation for me, because it came in about 1985 or 86, I suppose, when I first taught this class, which was a couple of years prior to my writing of Under Cover of Daylight. And the notion that I had in this class was that I would choose famous bestsellers of the past, books like Gone with the Wind, From Here to Eternity, and so on, big bestsellers of different decades, 40s, 50s, 60s, and on to today. And that in my elitist, snobbish, academic way, I was going to show that these books were vastly inferior to the books of the literary canon, the Hemingways and Faulkners and so on, and that these books were built on faulty literary premises and had stereotypical characters and filled with cliches, and the style of them was superficial and stupid. And what I found was, having never read these books until I started teaching them in this class, is I really loved these books. I thought they were really good. They had Gone with the Wind has a lot of stereotypical characters and cliches and so on, but it's good nevertheless, and it's very moving and very powerful. And it was this amazing revelation to me. And I got about 2 or 3 weeks into the course when I discovered this. I thought, oh my God, now what am I going to do? I can't make fun of these books anymore. I have to admit in front of my graduate students that I actually like these books, and you know, call into question a whole set of preconceptions about what the divisions in literature truly are.
Mm-hmm.
And so what we did instead in that class, and they were with me, they said, okay, let's see what this is like. Some of them fought me because they still wanted to believe that the literary canon was superior to these books, and they had a vested interest in that. They'd been getting their BA, and the whole premise of their schooling was that I am learning the right books and learning to appreciate the deeper things, and that I should reject the popular culture books and artistic things because they have no merit. So instead of mocking these books, I started to accumulate, almost like a sociologist, what do these books have in them in common with each other, which makes them potentially such powerful, mythic works, and why do they have such enormous power over people? I think all this just opened up for me the possibility that I could write a book like the one that I secretly loved, rather than the one that I was teaching and that my colleagues would admire if I wrote a mainstream novel.
Too. Yeah. You mentioned mythic qualities. I know that that was an element of your study at the time, and you've referred in writing to a golden place in some of these, a book that's an element of a book like that, where the time and place, where everything is just kind of coherent and makes sense. And
that was one of the things that we found that was a recurrent image or a recurrent pattern in the bestsellers, that they described some golden place, some perfect. Sometimes it was a place from long ago and far away, back, like in Gone with the Wind. It's Terra before the war. It's that antebellum South, that golden, perfect place, which of course is flawed in Gone with the Wind because it's built on racism and slavery and suppression of people's rights and so on. But it still is a golden place for the individuals in the story. And so, yeah, to anticipate your question, I, of course, translated some of this stuff that I knew into the book that I was working on. Fortunately, I just happened to be, when I was writing my first novel, I happened to have moved from Miami, where I'd been living for many years, to Key Largo, Florida. So I was living there for about 3 years, and this was turning into my golden place. Without expecting it to happen, I moved there for various reasons, but it turns out that that place fulfilled a kind of set of needs in me that I hadn't anticipated entirely, and it became the golden place that I wrote about and that I'm still writing about in some ways now.
And yet you've also said that in writing, that as you sort of prepare to write, you go to your word processor, you sort of descend into it and you don't come out. And I don't remember your exact words, but I think you said it was a scary place, a kind of a dark place, because all these kinds of things happen. You meet the villains, the Dougie from Bones of Coral.
Bones of Coral, yeah.
And Rays and Orlons and so on, and they're all in there, and yet you also hear the sort of the babble, if you will, of all of the various voices, and you have to kind of work your way out of that. So,
yeah, well, the kind of books that I'm writing require that you know about evil and experience evil. They're not. I don't write crime novels. I don't know that much about police procedure and that sort of thing. So, what I have to do is build bridges to my unconscious where these dark, scary, mischievous, extremely mischievous people live, and in the id or someplace, wherever it may be. And they, yeah, in fact, I get paid to do what schizophrenics get locked away for. I get paid to listen to voices and to cultivate those voices and write down what they say, and then try to organize the voices into some meaningful structure. But it is a kind of scary, dark place that you can lose your way some days. I mean, you do, in a way, as a writer. I think if you're working at a certain level, you're attempting madness all the time. You're right on the edge of a kind of what society would brand as antisocial or psychotic behaviors, you court those, you learn about them, you develop them. Maybe in a slightly voyeuristic way. You don't get up from the table and act out in
yeah.
a loony way, or ideally you don't. There are writers who do, who can't turn it off and go out into the world and continue to act in antisocial ways.
And be very crazy. In the crime novel itself, you've also defended mystery writers as being, I'm trying to quote, something about the only group of writers who create works that are of the overall broad social scope,
Right.
and who really take on all of these issues, as opposed to the police procedurals. You're talking about a whole variety of things: endangered species, kidnapping, child abuse, and so on.
Well, I think this is an attitude that I've had to develop in the face of the occasional question from the elitist academic snob who I used to be, and I have to find a way to answer that person's question. Why you? Because the assumption is you used to be on the Supreme Court, and now you're a personal injury attorney. You used to be a writer of poetry. Now you're writing these gutter books. And I have to find some answer for that. My answer basically is that these books have a wider social scope, are more Dickensian, more brave and honest in many ways, not just mine, but many mystery writers these days, than the average mainstream novel is, which just looks at domestic minutia in large part. My grandmother died, and then 600 pages we have her funeral. That, to me, is a novel that doesn't take a lot of chances.
Yeah. Is the approach from the poetry that you've written, is the approach of poetry to fiction very different or very the same? Or
it's very different. I thought it was the same. I thought language was language, but it's sort of like going from the clarinet to the bugle, or two instruments that you blow into one end of them and music comes out the other, but that's not necessarily doing one does not necessarily prepare you for doing the other. In fact, in some ways, it was a hindrance because I thought I was better than I was. I thought I could write circles, since I was a poet, that I could write circles around all these fiction writers and just dash off something that would be beautiful without really realizing how difficult it is, and that it actually involves plot and a character who changes and develops and grows, and that you have to be sympathetic towards. And a lot of things were just left out.
And maintain it for all of about 400 pages
Exactly.
or
It's
more.
much, much harder than sitting down and writing a little block of words that all hang together.
We just have a few seconds left, actually. I was curious as to what you have in the works right now. Anything forthcoming?
I'm writing a book that I got the idea for when I was standing in the jungles in Borneo and leeches were falling out of the trees, and I said, my God, what am I doing here? I live in Miami. I could have written about Martinique or the Bahamas or something that took me to the Caribbean. So that's what I'm doing now. I'm writing a cruise ship caper.
A cruise ship caper.
Forcing me to take cruises, which I never did really want to do, but I'm doing it. By gosh, somebody's got to do it.
Well, I wish you luck in it, and thank you very much. The new book is
Bruce.
Gone Wild
Thank
from
you
Delacorte.
very much.
Appreciate it. Thank you very much.
A presentation of the Hennepin County Library.